What is pronunciation and what is accent? What's the difference? Hi everyone, I'm Adrian. I'm an accent coach and pronunciation trainer, and I help my students improve their pronunciation and accent in English to sound less foreign and more native. And I teach the American accent. In this video, we're going to be talking about what the difference is between pronunciation and accent, and how the phonology, you'll be able to improve and sound more native in whatever language you're working on. What is pronunciation and what is accent? What's the difference? A lot of students ask me this, and a lot of people use these terms interchangeably, but I use them differently, and here is how. Pronunciation is being able to be understood easily, and accent is just how you speak and may identify you as being part of a particular group, American, British, or some socioeconomic group like a lower class educated, or rather linguistic group like native or non-native. And to understand how you can improve your pronunciation and your accent, we're going to need to be talking about phonemes and allophones and phonology. We're going to use a little bit of scientific terminology from the field of linguistics, from phonetics and phonology, to help you understand how to differentiate these terms and why they're important if you're working on your accent and your pronunciation, and that's why I use those two terms separately. They're related, but not identical. So sounds are not just sounds. We need to be more specific than that. There are phonemes and there are allophones. Let's talk about phonemes first. Phonemes are a mental construction of a sound that is used as a basic building block of a word. And so they distinguish words. If you switch one phoneme for another phoneme, then you will have changed the word. So in order to have good pronunciation, you will need to be able to distinguish phonemes. For example, in English, the R and L sounds are different phonemes. If you have the word red, but you pronounce it like lead, you'll have pronounced a completely different word. That's why we know that R and L are different phonemes, because they distinguish different words. However, what's a phoneme in one language is not necessarily a phoneme in a different language, because in that language's mental model, those two sounds may not distinguish different words. So for example, in Japanese, let's say you got the word sayonara, and you got kind of an R-L sort of sound there, sayonara. If you pronounce it more like an L, sayonara, it doesn't change the meaning. If you pronounce it more like an English R, sayonara, it doesn't really change the meaning. It's still understood. So R and L are not different phonemes there. They're different sounds physically, but they're not mentally different sounds, and they don't distinguish different words, and therefore they're not phonemes. And because of this, you don't need to distinguish those two things to be understood. And so in order to have a comprehensible pronunciation, you just need to be able to distinguish the phonemes. Even though you may not have the exact sounds that native speakers use when pronouncing those phonemes, you will still be understood and you'll have a decent, comprehensible pronunciation. And so that's what phonemes are. The mental units of sounds that you use to distinguish words like red and lead and ran and lan. And you just need to pronounce it within the acceptable range to be understood as saying this particular phoneme. If you say it outside of the acceptable range, you may have the sound fall into another range of a different phoneme and therefore be misunderstood. So for example, in English, we have and a, like in bet and bat. A lot of languages don't have the difference between and a. If you say your like a with your mouth a bit too open, you'll be saying a different phoneme, and that will be a different word, because bet and bat are different words, even though in other languages and a may not be different phonemes. Now let's talk about allophones. Whereas phonemes are the mental units of sound that distinguish words, allophones are the physical variants of the phonemes when they're actually produced. And these don't distinguish words, but they do make you sound more or less native, or from this dialect group, or from that dialect group, or from this part of the country, etc. Each phoneme has at least one allophone, because it's a physical thing that's actually coming out of your mouth. However, most phonemes actually have more than one allophone. And these allophones, if you mispronounce them, as long as it's still an allophone of the same phoneme, you'll be understood. It won't cause confusion. but you may have a funny accent. Let's look at an example of an allophone in English. So we have the patuka sounds in English, and these sounds are often aspirated. Aspirated sounds are sounds that have a puff of air when you pronounce the sound. When we say the word table, you can hear I said table. There's a sound there. Table. That's how we say table. Even though it's very fast, we say table normally. We don't say table. However, lots of languages don't have aspiration, like in Spanish or in Russian. When they say the word table, they might say table. But if you said table instead of table without the aspiration, we would still understand you as native speakers 100%, because the t sound is still an allophone of t. It's not a native way of saying it, but it is an allophone. It still counts as that phoneme. We still understand it as that t phoneme, even though it's the wrong allophone. We have the t allophone in English for the t sound in certain positions, like when we say stable. So stable, you can hear that the t there is not aspirated. We don't say stable. We say stable. But without the s sound there, it becomes table. That's an example of a non-native accent. And it's accented because the allophones are not quite right. The pronunciation may still be understandable, but the accent's not quite right. So here's an example with native types of English where the accents differ because the allophones are used differently. In most types of English, we have two types of L allophones for the L phoneme. And the first one is a L sound, a clear L, we often call it. And then the other one, the other allophone, is a dark L, ol. L and ol. In some types of English, however, I think Irish, for example, there is only the clear L and there's no dark L. They might say things like little instead of little. Little is how most English speakers pronounce it, and little with the same L in the front and the back is how Irish English speakers pronounce it. So we talked about acceptable range for phonemes, which is larger. As long as you pronounce it here, it's still understood as a phoneme of that group. But for allophones, it's stricter. It's a smaller range for you to be understood as being from a particular group. So now let's talk about how this goes together, how allophones and phonemes go together. This is a system called phonology, which is kind of like the grammar of sounds, because there's a rule of when certain phonemes are produced as certain allophones. It's allophone A in this context, it's allophone B in that context, and you can predict it because there are rules. So that's why I like to call it the grammar of sound. For example, for clear and dark L, the first L is a L sound because clear L happens at the start of syllables, and then the last L, the second L, is a dark L sound because it happens at the end, and dark L is an allophone that happens at the end of syllables, and the end of a word is an end of a syllable, so you get little. And with the aspiration example, the phonological rule for that is that the patuka sound becomes aspirated if it's at the start of the word or the start of a stressed syllable. So when we say table, it starts the word. The T sound starts the word, and so it's aspirated. We don't say table because, according to the rule, any patuka sound has to be aspirated if it starts the word, and table starts with a T sound. There's another rule saying if you have a T sound or a patuka sound after an S sound, you cannot aspirate it. And so we say stable, and we can't say stable. That's not possible. For my students of accent and pronunciation, this is really important because it's not enough to know how to produce the sound. You also need to know where to produce the sound, because if you're saying the right sound but in the wrong place, it's still wrong. So we have to work on that and understand where it happens. So how do you know if you have to work on your pronunciation or accent? Well, if people don't understand you and they regularly don't understand you on particular sounds, then maybe you have to work on your pronunciation because you're probably pronouncing those sounds as a different phoneme. It's being understood as a different phoneme than the sound you're trying to say. Whereas if people understand you with no problems at all and they completely understand you, but they keep telling you, oh, are you from this place or that place, then you probably have to work on your allophones, because that's an accent problem that deals with allophones. Now this is actually what I do, so if you're interested in this, I actually do have a video course for pronunciation which deals with all the sounds of English and will help you not be misunderstood. It has all the sounds and it'll teach you how to pronounce them in the right way so that you can have those phonemes easily distinguishable. I also have a video course on American accent for speakers of Russian because that's one of my biggest student groups, and I'm going to be making more of these accent courses as well, but these deal with the more minute details like with allophones, and of course all of the courses deal a bit with phonology because you need to know where to pronounce a sound, and I like teaching accent. It's much more in-depth, much more scientific, and I think it's a lot more fun. So that is what allophones and phonemes and pronunciation and accent and phonology are. And so that's my video. So if you have any questions, comment them below. I love responding to questions, or message me on my socials. And together, let's make your accent amazing.